The following reading is from an email sent to me in 1998 by a fellow genealogy researcher and second cousin. He had access to a diary written on a wagon train crossing taking the Oregon Trail out of Council Bluffs, Iowa, that left May 15th, 1852. He also had some family research he added to that, and the main character is William C. Rutledge, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, born in 1794 in Maryland. The following 10-page text reads as follows. William C. Rutledge Crossing the Plains. The year was 1794. George Washington was serving his second term as president of the newly created United States of America when on August 16th of that year was born in Maryland, in the district of Mine Run Hundred, one William C. Rutledge. He grew to manhood there and also spent some time in the adjoining area of York County, Pennsylvania. In 1814, he was drafted from York County to serve in the War of 1812, which he did until the close of the war later that year. As he served less than 3 months he was drafted for, it was less than a month, he did not get the $8 which he normally would have received. Instead, he received $6.37, of which 26 cents was for travel pay. A few months later, he married Margaret Moore in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Margaret's forebears fled France at the time or shortly after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when Huguenots were terribly persecuted by the Catholic Church. With the help of neighbors, some of whom were themselves of the Catholic faith, they fled to Scotland, leaving their possessions behind, glad to escape with their lives. Their stay in Scotland was temporary, and soon they emigrated to Pennsylvania, which at the time was still a colony, settling in Lancaster County. Margaret was born on March 3rd, 1792. While still a baby in her mother's arms, a drunk frightened their buggy horse during a 4th of July celebration which was noted for its drunken revelry. Margaret and her mother were thrown out of their buggy, it being fatal for her mother. Thus was the little girl deprived of a mother's love because of a drunk. William's earliest ancestor in America was John Rutledge, who came to Maryland in 1640. Genealogists claim that all Maryland Rutledges of the time of William's birth were descendants of John. Unfortunately, it has been impossible to prove generation by generation. William became a blacksmith and a wagon maker, having developed his skill through the apprentice system. He followed this trade in his early years, supporting his family, having married Margaret about 1817. Their first home was in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where their first child, a son, John C., was born in July 28, 1818. Ever apparently restless, they were living in Baltimore County, Maryland, where their second son, William Moore, was born, June 26, 1820. On April 27, 1822, their first daughter, Rachel, was born, but died in infancy. In 1823, they were living in Morgan County, Ohio, when a son, David M., was born, May 15, 1823. Katie Ann Elizabeth, their second daughter, was born on February 26, 1825. By 1827, they moved a little farther to Guernsey County, Ohio, where the rest of their children were born. A son, George Washington, was born on June 3, 1827. a daughter, Margaret Jane, on January 1st, 1830. Also sons Thomas Elliot on March 6, 1831, and Andrew Jackson on January 28, 1833, as well as their last child, Rachel Amanda, on November 8, 1834. While living in Ohio, they were converted under the preaching of the Methodist circuit rider. Although William became a strong Methodist and remained so throughout his life, he continued to chew tobacco, much to the dismay of some of his family, especially his son Thomas. This practice may have contributed to stomach ulcers, which eventually proved fatal. William and Margaret preferred the adventurous life that the frontier could provide. He was an avid hunter and of an independent nature. While hunting wild turkey, he carelessly suffered a severe injury to his left arm, resulting in the loss of the upper muscle. He had leaned on top of his rifle when the gun accidentally discharged. The doctor wanted to amputate, but he protested so strongly that the doctor agreed not to. The arm was always weak, but the grip in his hand was spared. Hence, he was ever after handicapped in his work by a weakened arm. In 1841, they left Ohio and headed for Indiana, living eventually in Posey County, in the southernmost part of the state. While there, one of their sons, Andrew J., died of typhoid fever on September 24, 1848, when he was just 15. 10 children were born to William and Margaret, 6 sons and 4 daughters, 5 sons and 3 daughters living to maturity. In December 1851, they sold possessions they couldn't take with them and made their way to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where wagon trains formed for the trip across the plains to the Pacific coast. The family members who joined this venture were William and Margaret and their 2 remaining children still living at home, Thomas and his sister Jane, with her infant son, Henry Cleveland. Also going along were William Jr., his wife Sarah, who claimed to be a niece of General Winfield Scott, and their 2 young daughters, 6-year-old Electra Ann and 1-year-old Cornelia. A son, Charles M., and another daughter, Delia, had died in Posey County, Indiana, of scarlet fever in February 1850 before the journey. Thus they spent the winter of 1851-52 outfitting their wagons for the journey. They bought oxen, Thomas bought a Kentucky rifle, a few prized possessions were packed. This included a supply of dried foods, cooking utensils for a campfire, and William C.'s extensive blacksmithing equipment. The latter include the large bellows which was stowed in one of the wagons. Needless to say, these were very important in making repairs on the wagons while on the journey. Thus equipped, they headed for the plains and the Pacific coast, or Oregon, as the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming were called. They had no definite destination in view, as they knew no one in the Oregon country. Quoting from an account written by Thomas, left Council Bluffs, Iowa, on the 15th day of May, 1852, for the Pacific coast. After 4 months' travel, landed at the Dalles in Oregon, stopped a few days to recruit, then left for Puget Sound, got in October 1852, settled on Bush Prairie. So it was after 5 months' travel they came to the end of their journey. It had not been all that easy. There had been dissensions in the train, and many cholera deaths. Men would become short-tempered due to discouragement and exhaustion. It was extremely tiring to walk with ox teams all day, then spend the night on guard duty or herding cattle. The first day from Council Bluffs was not a bit encouraging, as the whole day had been spent crossing a swampy area. The spring thaw was on, and the swampy area was extremely soft. Extra yoke of oxen were hitched to each wagon, then unhitched, driven back, and hitched onto another. It was necessary to leave for the trip in the year as early in the year as possible so as to not be snowbound in the mountains in the west. To be caught meant almost certain death. Of course, that meant the plains were crossed in the hottest time of the year. The first casualty occurred in crossing the Platte River when one of the young men was pulled under some drift. Little time was spent looking for the body, time being too valuable. It is not known how many wagons were in the train the Rutledge family was in, but it was considered to be a large one. The year 1852, according to some historians, was one of the largest migration years. Thomas said that as far as the eye could see, there were wagons. Also, it was a year when the dread cholera took a heavy toll on the people. The cattle were stricken with what was commonly called bloody murrain, and of course the loss of oxen was a serious matter. To be stranded with a wagon and no oxen to pull it was indeed very serious and sometimes fatal for the occupants. The train hadn't been out very many weeks when dissension arose over traveling on Sunday. Those who favored traveling on Sunday argued that time was valuable, the distance to be traveled great, the cattle would scatter while grazing, and nobody would really get much rest. The Sunday keepers believed that everybody, including oxen, needed a break from the arduous of travel. So great was the dissension, a vote was taken, with the result being that the train was divided about in half. New wagon masters were elected, and next Sunday the train was split. The most of the Rutledge family rested on Sunday, but William Jr. and his wife and children chose Sunday travel, so it was that even families were divided. Before leaving Indiana, William C.'s eldest son, John C., and I pause to insert, that is my family's relative, John C., back to the reading, who was a practicing physician in Posey County, strongly urged the family not to drink any water until it was boiled. This they did faithfully, even when on the hot, dusty plains. The William C. group wasn't stricken, but whether drinking only boiled water was the only reason or not is open to question. As the days grew into weeks, more and more troubles plagued the train. They began to see mute evidence of some of the trouble those ahead were experiencing. Bleached bones of cattle and horses, graves desecrated by Indians or wild animals, the bodies being mutilated, and many abandoned wagons and possessions littering the trail sides. It was not unusual to gather enough abandoned ox yokes to build a corral for their cattle. It was not long before they began to experience similar problems. Cholera struck with a vengeance, so that nearly half were left in shallow graves. To discourage desecration of the graves, they were dug in the trail so that the wagons were driven over them, thus concealing their location. The cholera had one advantage in that the Indians stayed away. They were almost always in view of the train, so they knew graves were being dug. They were attacked but once by a band of Sioux. The wagon train quickly formed in a circle and the accepted way to fend off attacks. The Indians rode a number of times around the train, but never pressed their attack. No shots were fired and no arrows sent. The cholera bothered the train till they reached the mountains, though, but by that time it had taken a heavy toll. After dividing over the Sunday travel issue, the Sunday keepers caught up with the Sunday travelers. It was after a number of weeks, and the wagons had crossed the plains. They found the Sunday travelers had experienced much of the same troubles, mainly cholera. The two trains did not reunite, but traveled near each other for a time. The Sunday travelers thought the Sunday keepers had bought fresh oxen as they looked better than theirs, but of course there were none to be bought from the plains. Later, William C. bought a team of oxen from the Mormons who brought supplies to Fort Bridger, Wyoming. The Mormons were shrewd traders and knew that supplies were many times sorely needed. He paid $400 for a team, which was a high price. Since they had traveled a long time and had a long way to go, they bought them even at unfair prices. They showed their disregard for the Mormons by naming the team after the Mormon leaders, Joe and Brigham. So it was that they continued their journey to Oregon, powered by Mormon oxen. Their next stop at civilization was when the Dalles was reached in September. At best, they had traveled only 12 to 15 miles a day. It was a welcome change to have wood for cooking after many weeks of cooking over buffalo chips on the plains. Before leaving Council Bluffs, the women were made aware of the fact of cooking over buffalo chips on the plains. Some vowed they'd have nothing to do with such fuel, but being mostly frontier women and more or less used to making do with what was at hand, they quickly adjusted to the situation, even gathering the chips in their aprons. Upon reaching the Dalles, the wagon train began to break up. Some apparently knew where they were going, many going to the Willamette Valley. The Rutledge party was undecided where to end their journey until some told them of the Puget Sound country. They were told it was a most healthful climate to live in, that if you wanted to die it was necessary to go 100 miles from it, that it was a mild winter there and never snowed, so they set Tumwater, Washington, as their destination. In descending the Columbia River for Portland, all wagons and goods, together with the women and children and some of the men, boarded barges or boats. The cattle were to be driven along the bank, with the plan to join those on the river upon reaching Portland. Neither mode of travel was any great break, as there was a portage on the river, which meant unloading and reloading. The men driving the cattle were probably worse off. Thomas Rutledge, then 21, was among those driving the livestock. The terrain was rough, the road or trail was not much, the cattle were hard to keep together, and the Indians were ever present to disrupt as much as possible. While thus driving toward Portland, the young man in charge of provisions, food, bedding, and such got some whiskey and was sleeping off a drunk when the others started their drive. Thinking he'd waken and catch up with them, they left him alone, which proved to be a mistake. A group of Indians came upon the camp, and while they didn't harm him, they stole all the provisions, including the guns. Thus dispossessed, he returned to Dallas, leaving the others with no provisions and no guns, which they could have shot game with. To compound the situation further, a fire had recently ravaged the area, so there were not even berries to be had. They were without food and became so desperate that when they came upon an abandoned camp where the Indians had been drying fish, and there were discarded fish after shaking the maggots from them, they ate those. Their trip down the Columbia was as trying as the crossing of the plains. Meanwhile, the William Jr. family was entering the Portland area by way of the Barlow Trail, thus crossing the mountains below the Columbia River. The William Rutledge families were reunited at Portland and proceeded to Puget Sound, where William and Margaret took a donation land claim of 320 acres on the Bush Prairie, where Trosper Lake is, and Glenwood Park, and where Glenwood Park is now located. Arriving at Tumwater in October 1852, they quickly built a house of lumber from the Tumwater Mill. William Moore prospered by opening a mercantile establishment in Olympia, selling clothing, groceries, and household goods to the populace. Both William C. and Margaret Moore made input into the local political scene. William C. as a delegate to the 1856 Thurston County Democratic Territorial Convention, and William Jr. was a Thurston County representative and served on committee to select delegates for the county convention. Later, in about 1865, William Jr. moved south to Calcado, county seat of Lewis County, and eventually settled permanently in Waterloo, Linn County, Oregon. In the late 1850s, Amanda Rutledge Cleveland's relatives had settled in the Bush Prairie area. By the mid-1860s, Amanda became quite ill with dropsy, and the family was advised by doctors to return her to the Midwest. The quickest way to return home was by boat, so Winfield Scott Cleveland and wife, Amanda, and their children left Washington Territory with what possessions they could bring by boat to return to Illinois. They had to get off the boat at the Isthmus of Panama. They were pulled across the isthmus in a cart drawn by a pair of zebra. Having crossed the isthmus, they boarded a boat and went to port in New York City. By this time, the family's meager funds were exhausted, and they were stranded in a large city with no way to make the trek from New York to Illinois, where the Cleveland relatives lived. Winfield was able to arrange a loan from a strange man in the city by offering his sons George Washington and his brother as security. No doubt the ailing mother bade her sons a very tearful farewell as she left with her husband and the remainder of her family to come back to Illinois. Once back in Illinois, Winfield was able to establish his wife and family in a home, borrow money from relatives, and to return to New York to redeem his two sons. Quoting from an account by Thomas Rutledge, "We had been informed it never snowed out here. We found that not true. In December it commenced snowing and snowed for 1 week. The snow was 3 feet over the face of the earth, and to find so much snow in a country where it never snowed was a stunner. It was a wet snow when it fell, but it turned cold and froze such a crust on the snow that we could walk on top of the snow. We brought 5 yoke of oxen with us. Here we were without any kind of feed and could not get any. Father had me drive the oxen into the woods where sallow was, and had me keep them going to make them eat the sallow. It was a woodchuck case, root hog or die. It was well known that yoked oxen would browse on brush when driven, and in this way this saved them from starving, although they were reduced to skin and bone by spring. A more established settler near Tenino, whose name is unknown to this writer, had 2 tons of hay for sale, for which he asked $100 a ton, and had no trouble getting that price. Previous winters had been open, and the prairies were full of good feed all winter long. Hence few put up any hay. Of course the newcomers had no opportunity to harvest anything. The loss of cattle and horses throughout the area was great. Such was their introduction to Puget Sound country, Oregon Territory. Thomas and a couple of the other young men were bitten by gold fever and planned a trip to the gold fields in Caribou County in Canada, near the boundary of Okanogan County. His mother had made a friend of one of the Indian women, and when the Indian woman learned of the planned trip in the Caribou country, she told Thomas' mother not to let him go, as the Indians were planning an uprising. When Thomas was told this by his mother, he was inclined not to take it seriously, but because he and his mother were so close, he stayed home to please her. The others went out with him, or without him, and were killed in the uprising. This was prior to the Indian uprising in this area. On June 4th, 1853, Jane Rutledge married a bachelor neighbor, Jesse Ferguson, a member of the party of the first Americans to settle Puget Sound. Tumwater was settled in 1845 by what was commonly called the Simmons Party. She and Jessie had 4 children: Sam, Dave, Sarah, and Annie. Jane died at a young age, January 29, 1861, leaving her husband with 5 to care for in all, as her son Henry Cleveland lived with them. Jessie never remarried, remaining a widower, dying in 1900. The Tumwater Middle School on Little Rock Road is located where his house stood for many years. With the help of his neighbors, William quickly erected near his house a blockhouse for the accommodation of the Ferguson, Gordon, and Rutledge families. During the occupation of the blockhouse, a daughter was born to William and Sarah Rutledge. The uprising occupied the latter part of 1855 and the early part of 1856. The Indians in the Tumwater area, the Chehalis Indians, never really went on the warpath, but the fear was always present in that the other tribes would incite them to violence. The few whites that were killed in Thurston County were at the hands of the Nisqually Indians in the eastern part of the county. Thomas served in the war carrying his Kentucky rifle. Although he served elsewhere than in Thurston County, he was never in actual battle. When asked if he ever killed an Indian, he said no, and I never wanted to. In May of 1856, he took up 160 acres on Black River, about 10 miles from his parents' claim on Bush Prairie. There was no real road between the 2 claims, and supplies were packed by horseback. He had more or less considered this claim when the Indian uprising interrupted everything. He built a log cabin, and on July 24th, 1856, he married a neighbor girl, Louisa Shotwell, daughter of John and Eleanor Shotwell. The Shotwells had crossed the plains the same year, 1852, but were not in the same train and did not know each other until each other took up a claim along Black River. Louisa Shotwell was born in Claremont County, Ohio, on May 5, 1839. As the Indian War drew to a close, Margaret began to have failing health. Eventually it proved to be cancer, forcing her to become bedridden. Thomas and Louisa moved in with his parents so they could help care for her. Thomas was especially fond of his mother, and because he'd had some medical training in Indiana under his oldest brother John, he was doubly able and willing to care for her. The treatment consisted mostly of large doses of morphine to reduce the suffering. She continued in this condition for 2 years, dying October 8, 1858. The local weekly paper carried her obituary notice as follows: died on the Bush Prairie, Thurston County, W.T., October 8th, of cancer. Margaret, wife of William Rutledge Sr., aged 66 years, 7 months, and 5 days. The deceased joined the M.E. Church in Ohio, lived 32 years in, and died an acceptable member of the same. The last 2 years of her life was a time of extreme suffering, one confined nearly entirely to her bed. 48 hours before she died, she called the family to her bedside and said, "I am dying," then prayed. When, as if supernaturally strengthened, she shouted aloud praises to God, and taking leave of each, added, "Meet me in heaven." A few hours after I arrived, she requested me to pray, and after prayer said, "My work is done, let me rest." About 2 hours before Death finished his work, she answered, being spoken to, "All is well." This was the last. A large circle of relatives and friends are left to mourn her departure, but our loss is her gain. Slightly confusing there. It is not e'en death to gain to thee, whose life to God was given. Gladly to earth their eyes they close to open them in heaven. Their toils are past, their work is done, and they are fully blessed. They fought the fight, the victory won, and entered into rest. N.S. McAllister. N.S. McAllister was the local Methodist preacher, probably a circuit-riding preacher. During the time Margaret was bedridden, William Thomas was born, June 24, 1857, the first of 9 children born to Thomas and Louisa. Upon the death of Margaret, she willed to Thomas her half of the donation claim, 160 acres. It was valued at $10 per acre. By selling it, he was able to get started on his own homestead, also purchasing the adjoining claim for $1,200 from Parson Quinn. His reason for doing so was to sell it at the same price to his brother, George Washington, who had been planning to move to the west. The log cabin Thomas had built 2 years earlier was accompanied by a barn built of logs. Also built at the same time, it was divided into 5 compartments, all small, one which was used as a threshing floor for either treading or flailing grain. On April 27, 1859, a daughter, Ellen, was born to them in their log cabin. In 1861, as the Civil War was starting on the East Coast, Thomas was building a house of box construction, which was common type. Before it was completed, another daughter, Emma, was born on June 10, 1861. They were becoming rather crowded in the cabin, so they moved to a new house. Was almost welcome. On August 19, 1863, a son, Marion, was born, the first to be born in the new house. In all, 15 births occurred in the new house, 8 of Thomas's children and 7 of his grandchildren. As the farmland was cleared and the larger barn was needed, Thomas hired his brother-in-law, Winfield Scott Cleveland, to supervise the construction of another barn. It was to be of hand-hewn lumbers of frame construction, mortise and tenon joints, and secured with wooden pegs. The dimensions were to be 74 feet by 124 feet. After preparing the timbers, making the mortise and tenon joints, making the pegs, and boring the holes for them, the barn raising took place in the summer of 1864. Help came from the other settlers in the area, as neighbor helped neighbor on such occasions. Cooking for a barn-raising crew was no small undertaking. By that time, Louisa had 4 small children to take care of, in itself a near full-time job, with what having to do the washings by hand. She did have the advantage of running water. A long pipe brought water from the spring to the kitchen, where there was a wooden sink, which must have been impossible to keep clean. However, it was the first house in the area with running water. It was a monumental task Thomas faced in clearing the river bottom land. For centuries the trees and brush grew and died until it was impossible to walk through much of it. He hired Indians to help slash and burn during the summer. In order to support his growing family, Thomas sold hay during the winter to the livery stables and logging camps. The usual price was $10 per ton, delivered. It took 4 hours to make the trip to Olympia. That meant leaving home in the dark, returning in the dark, loading by lantern light, and then heading back to Olympia before daylight the next morning. In the 1860s, he purchased a horse-powered grain separator and traveled over southern Thurston County as far into Gray's Harbor as Elma. There were few separators in the area, so the threshing season would last throughout the fall, sometimes as late as into December. It proved to be a profitable business, paying for itself the first year. The separator was powered by 10 horses marching in a circle on sweeps. A long tumbling rod ran from the sweep to the machine. By the late 1880s, the steam-operated machine replaced the horsepower. Ever one to try better To better his situation, Thomas purchased a mowing machine, a Buckeye, in 1869 from Gustav Rosenthal, the early merchant in Olympia. Rosenthal claimed it was the first in Puget Sound area, but Nathan Eaton on Chambers Prairie was said to have one earlier. At any rate, it was a great improvement over the Skith. After Margaret's death in 1858, William married Mary Ann Coe, a widow, on May 20th, 1860. She lived only a short time, dying January 17th, 1861. Not to be discouraged, he married yet a third time, which ended in a separation. He then moved to make his home with Thomas. It must have been a noisy household with 3 generations and so many children. In 1872, William was stricken while on his way to his blacksmith shop, located across the road from Thomas's house. Apparently he suffered from stomach ulcers and one of them started bleeding. They put him to bed, but he lived only a few days. He wanted the Methodists to come and they sang some hymns and had a prayer, and he was satisfied, and he was ready to die and wasn't afraid. So it was on June 1st, 1872, his life here came to a close. He was buried the next day in Old Bush Prairie Cemetery, where already several members of his family lay. In his lifetime, he had traveled from coast to coast via oxen team. Nor was serious illness banished from the Rutledge household. Louisa was stricken with what was diagnosed as tuberculosis, but in later years was thought to be cancer. It seems that 2 of her brothers suffered from the same ailment. She was ill for several years and nothing seemed to help, finally departing this life on February 24th, 1877, aged 37 years. She left a family of 9 children, ranging in age from 19 years to 3 years, her husband and parents, as well as several brothers and 1 sister. So my family, that ends the letter. There was supposed to be more added to it later, but I never checked back to see if there was more written. And the cousin of mine actually passed away not long after that. And I do not know the location or whereabouts of the diary that was noted. I believe I remember in a conversation I had with him that it was going to be back in the relative's attic after he was through with it. So, it was a little mystery. So, the son of William C. that my line is descended from is John, and he lived he was the doctor out in Indiana, and I grew up hearing about Doc Rutledge out in Indiana. So there's some stuff in the Genealogy Society's library or something out there. I think I called them once too. And then we have actual photographs of his son, Edgar. He was a graphic designer and a circuit court clerk in Cook County until 1920. He actually designed a label for Old Style one, so that's Edgar Everett Rutledge, who was the son of John, who is the son of William. And that brings us to within 2 generations of my dad. That's his mother's family. And it's just kind of interesting to sit here and think about, half my family splitting up that long ago, 1852, taking the Oregon Trail out there. I would love if anybody has any knowledge on the whereabouts of that diary. I would greatly love to see a copy of it. But I guess that's about all I have to say. Yeah, because a lot of this is family history just presented in the born, death, and major events thing, but the diary, that reads like a day-to-day, and that gives you words directly from them, or at least, of the period, if it's, a friend of theirs. All right. Thanks for listening to this little story about my Rutledge line.